Well, good evening. Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure to be back in Norway. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to return. And also, I'm sorry my Norwegian hasn't improved in the interim. So thank you very much for bearing with me again as I'm speaking to you in English. But also speaking to you about a relatively familiar topic now, because the last time I spoke for MIF, I think it was in 2022, I was asked to speak about an Amnesty International report that alleged apartheid against Israel. And I believe this talk is still online. I used the opportunity to go through not the entirety of the report, but I think a fair good sample of the falsehoods that were contained therein, not least equating all of the population between the river and the sea, conflating thereby Israeli citizens with citizens of the Palestinian autonomy, and claiming therefore discrimination between them. But that's a past lecture. The reason that I remark on it is because I'm essentially asked today to grapple with another report of Amnesty International, and this is a report alleging genocide. And the reason that it's important to grapple with the heinous false accusation, this time of genocide, is that it is part and parcel of what we see in terms of the weaponization of international law against the only Jewish state. And I think the reason that this should be of deep concern, not just to MIF membership, Mit Israel für Fred, I get that you all support the state of Israel, but it needs to be absolutely top priority for all of those who might not actually care very much about Israel, but do care about rule of law and care about Western civilization and Western liberal values, which are ultimately under threat by the same processes and the same actors that are weaponizing international law against Israel. They threaten all rule of law countries. Because when you devalue international law, and when you devalue, as Amnesty International and others have, these key legal concepts of apartheid and genocide, you create a free-for-all. Everything is relative, nothing is true, and it fits very strongly with this world we have now entered of alternative facts. It's something that we need to push back on very strongly and very robustly. And in the time that we have together, I wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the issues with this new Amnesty International report, and also leave as much time as possible for your questions. And they can be, of course, on anything international law related in terms of the current developments, everything that we're witnessing on the ground in Gaza in this 7-front war that Israel has been fighting for a year and a half now. But let's not lose sight of this 8th front, which I consider to be vitally important. It is the front that incorporates international law, the international media, the academy, and it is part and parcel of these falsehoods that are being propagated against Israel. The important, and this is extremely important when I'm speaking in this part of the world, where I fully appreciate these civil society organizations, they occupy hallowed ground. They are sacred. Amnesty, Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam. These were all organizations that were set up with lofty ambitions and ideals to stand up for international law and human rights, and they have all become an integral part of the vilification and victimization of Israel and the falsification of factual narratives and of legal narratives against the Jewish state. And the reason I think this is so imperative is that the consequences and the practical outcome of these false narratives is very real. I don't just refer to the execution of Jews and Israelis in the street, as we witnessed only last week in the capital of the free world in DC, and the brutal, senseless murders of Yaron and Sarah, where their shooter, who was Hispanic and came from Chicago, screamed, "Free, free Palestine," and this is for Gaza. That is a very practical outcome of the sorts of blood libels that we've seen, including through the use of these terms apartheid and genocide against Israel. But I also mean that the Palestinian casualties in this war, and let us be clear, there have been many. Civilians have died, as in every war, and that is the immense, lamentable tragedy of war. But those civilian casualties, I believe, were avoidable. The perpetuation of this conflict, the encouragement of Hamas, this all leads back to these civil society organizations also. Through the generation of this false narrative and what can be identified as a vicious cycle. This is false information that is Hamas propaganda. Right? We've had it admitted in Amnesty and reports, and including the methodology of this report on genocide, that they have spoken to local stakeholders and local authorities in Gaza. Who do they mean by that? Hamas. This is where they are getting their information from. They will be the first to tell you, we do not trust Israeli figures. We do not trust what Kogat says about aid going into the Gaza Strip. We do not trust what Israel says about the amount of combatants, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other Palestinian terrorists that they have eliminated, because these are the people that Israel is targeting. We don't believe Israel, but Hamas and an associate of theirs through the Union of Agricultural Works Committees, the PFLP, a recognized PFLP affiliate that is also credited in the report as having provided information. This is just one example of where this material is coming from. But let's just follow that cycle round for a moment. This information, this propaganda that comes from Hamas, that is reported by NGOs and their partners on the ground. Amnesty is not alone in this. That is then recycled into the reports of UN Special Human Rights Rapporteurs. I think you all know who I mean. That is then cited in UN resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, that are then relied on at the ICJ and the ICC, who are then in turn quoted again by the civil society organizations and these NGOs that are tasked with upholding international law and human rights. And it is in that vicious cycle of deceit and misinformation that these blood libels take hold and have the most devastating impact. And we have seen, in fact, only in the last few days, I think a very, very telling example of where the concern of these organizations lies. This features around a similar canard of starvation. In so many respects, it's relevant to a discussion on genocide because it forms a great deal of the substance of these allegations that Israel is seeking to annihilate the Palestinian people, something which is demonstrably false on the basis that Israel has done more than any other army in history to prevent civilian casualties, but also to facilitate more aid into the Gaza Strip than the requirements of the local population there demand. But Israel has, in an effort to prevent Hamas diversion of this aid, taken several measures. The latest is an initiative of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and you may have come across these aid distribution centers that have been set up, 4 of them so far, with US contractors and American support to be able to distribute aid to the heads of families who are registered and identified, and to do that directly to prevent Hamas stealing this aid, which they have been doing for the entire duration of this war. It was very telling that the UN was disparaging this system before it had even begun, trying to undermine it before it had the chance to improve the life of the Palestinians that they so frequently indicate they care about. What's behind that? I would suggest that this new aid distribution system proves not only the UN's incompetence in distributing aid previously, because all of these organizations and NGOs under the auspices of the United Nations have not been able to do so without Hamas diversion, but it also shows that these NGOs under the umbrella of the United Nations is necessarily complicit in propping up the Hamas war machine in order to continue to fund its ongoing terror against the State of Israel. This is, of course, the reason that Hamas is diverting this aid. The reports are that it has been selling it on the black market and generating funds to keep its war machine going. Now, one of the key insights that we have had through the blockade that was imposed after the ceasefire, and let's be clear for the record that the hostage release deal saw over 25,000 trucks going into the Gaza Strip, with estimates of the quantity of food that was transferred just in that period into Gaza being that it should have lasted between 5 and 6 months. I've even heard projections of 8 months, but let's take the conservative estimate and say 5 to 6. It's been 2.5 months, and the United Nations or others are saying that people are hungry in Gaza. Where has that aid gone? Why is nobody asking these questions? Why is the United Nations not asking these questions? Not only are they not doing that, but they are seeking to undermine the one mechanism in play which seeks to provide that aid to Palestinians without the diversion of Hamas. And in fact, this new aid distribution system is calling the bluff of those organizations crying famine. It shows that they are not interested in supporting Palestinians and getting rid of Hamas and preventing Hamas diversion. And it in fact shows that the real motivation here is far more likely seeking to uphold this decades-old system of the UN through UNRWA and Hamas in a cyclical relationship where they are supporting each other. It is simply not credible, on the one hand, to maintain that people are dying of hunger, and then on the other, to be calling against an operation intended to distribute food to the hungry. I also want to be clear that vulnerable people suffer in war. That is why it is so abhorrent that Hamas seeks to perpetuate this war and the suffering of civilians, rather than returning the hostages and laying down its arms so that this war could be over today. We've also seen a great deal of this outrage and clamour on the back of skeletal photos of children that have been plastered over social media and mainstream media. I'm sure you've all seen photos of this nature. Impossible not to be moved by that sort of imagery. I wonder how many of you have also noted the mothers of these children and how remarkably well fed they look. Now, I've never met a mother who would eat before her starving child. So something doesn't quite make sense here. And it seems to me that there is complicity in the international media, as well as in these NGOs, as well as in these UN bodies, complicity in propagating this sort of Hamas propaganda. And how more manipulative and disgusting can one get than to use what are clearly very ill children for these propaganda purposes. To a point, they have been identified as having serious underlying health conditions which have occasioned their very distressing condition. That is not because of a shortage of food in Gaza. That is certainly not because of any shortage of food in Gaza arising from Israeli actions. As we have seen from the COGAT numbers of aid going into the Gaza Strip, there is more food going in than required. And the reason I say that is it's one thing to look at these numbers, right? I said 25,000 trucks in the context of the hostage release deal. We've had over 1,700,000 trucks since the beginning of the war. But what does that mean in terms of the food amounts going in? Well, we've had a study of Israeli academics over the course of last year, between January to July 2004, looking at the calorific content of this food, which determined that on average there was over 3,000 calories per person per day facilitated into the Gaza Strip. Now that's twice as much as the Sphere International guidelines recommendations, but it's also significantly in excess of the NHS guidelines on the maximum calorific intake health guidelines, and I'm sure there is something equivalent in Norway. So that reality, that truth, of course, doesn't see the light of day. Instead, we have Tom Fletcher and others repeating this canard that 14,000 babies will die in the next 48 hours. That was repeated by 13 members of parliament in the United Kingdom. I still haven't heard corrections from many of them. Where does an so obviously absurd claim like that come from? Well, I can assist you with that, ladies and gentlemen. It came from an IPC report that in fact was making a projection that over the course of the next year, some 14,000 children, young people, not babies, might be subject to malnutrition. Now, first of all, that's a very, very different prospect. But the important thing to recognise is that the IPC has been wrong in every single one of its predictions in relation to Gaza so far. And UK Lawyers for Israel, an organisation I'm very privileged to have been involved in for over a decade now, has done a detailed analysis of each of these reports produced by the IPC up until the last one. They've come out with another one this month. But in fact, COGAT has done quite a succinct response to the last one. Every single one of these predictions has been demonstrated to be false on the basis of partial information, because they haven't been calculating the entirety of the volume of aid going into Gaza, and based on predictions where they are jumping to conclusions and making assumptions. The fact that that allegation, which should have collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity, 14,000 babies dying in 48 hours, the fact that that was so readily believed by so many is deeply indicative of a phenomenon to be very open to believe the worst of the state of Israel, even in the realm of the absurd. And that, unfortunately, does permeate through UN bodies and the IPC that is responsible for a great deal of this misinformation, layer upon layer upon layer of misinformation. And I hope on that basis, and it's really just a flavour, you start to get an understanding of how it can be that everybody says Israel is attacking children deliberately. Everybody says Israel is causing starvation. Everybody says Israel is guilty of apartheid or genocide. We see this through UN bodies, through pseudo-international legal bodies, and through the international media. And it is because of this repeated appeal to authority where one reinforces the other, where the IPC relies on Hamas propaganda, which is repeated by UN bodies and included in NGO reports, and relied on by the ICJ and the ICC. Now, these are two bodies, two international, supposedly legal institutions that sit in The Hague. Both have entertained this canard of starvation. It is the basis upon which arrest warrants have been issued at the ICC. That in and of itself is deeply problematic because it's a breach of the court's jurisdiction, it's a breach of the court's own rules, and importantly, complementarity. But primarily it is on the basis of entirely false information, on the basis of these false, debunked IPC reports that predicted a famine that never materialized. And it is testament to months and months and months of blood libel that turn public opinion against Israel and pressure it to cease its self-defense. This is the responsibility that these organizations have. And in picking up on just a couple of the issues in this report, because it is something that has specifically been asked of me, I mentioned in terms of the methodology where a great deal of this information comes from. But it was particularly galling to me to see reference to Israel's strikes, which it calls targeting civilians, essentially. I'll read, thank you so much. I'll read you just a very brief quote on this. Amnesty International's in-depth investigation found that all 15 locations, this were 15 locations it purported to investigate, all 15 locations that were struck were civilian objects, and that it was Israel which had launched the airstrikes. Amnesty International did not find any evidence that any of those strikes were directed at a military objective. A review of all available evidence showed that all those killed were civilians not taking a direct part in hostilities. What an example of taking Hamas propaganda and dressing it up in a report from an NGO. Now, Amnesty is clear that it's not on the ground, that it's not conducting these investigations itself, that it's reliant on local authorities for this information. But quite apart from that, anyone who knows anything about international law knows that this sort of strike analysis under the laws of armed conflict is not an effects-based analysis. It is always intention-based. Neither Amnesty International nor any other body out there can make any assessment about the legality of any of these strikes without information from Israel as to what the intention behind that strike was. What was Israel targeting? What was the proportionality analysis? What was the assessment? What was the intelligence pertaining to potential collateral damage? How was that factored in? They simply don't have access to any of this information. I mean, I would say this is a deeply, deeply irresponsible approach, but I'm afraid it goes far, far further than that. And it's important to note that those countries that Israel has shared this kind of sensitive intelligence with, including the UK and the US, have been consistent in their assessment that Israel is not in breach of international humanitarian law so far as targeting and proportionality is concerned. That's telling that those countries that have had access to the only information that can properly inform those sorts of assessments have consistently reached that conclusion. And as I say, this has been consistent throughout the war. The other aspect of this report, which it behoves me to pick up, is this attempt to rewrite international law, because even Amnesty seems to accept that even their false factual narrative doesn't quite fit the definition of genocide. Genocide is defined in the Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, and the key element of this crime is intention. It's specific intention, intention to eradicate a group in whole or in part. That is the Jewish experience of the Holocaust. That is what led to this term being coined, to be targeted for extermination because they were Jews. This is what Jews experienced on the 7th of October also, being targeted because they were Jews. And Hamas has made its mission repeatedly clear, to kill all of the Jews at every given opportunity, to repeat the 7th of October again and again and again. It was extraordinary to me that 2 days ago in Copenhagen, when the Amnesty International representative was asked if, forgive me, it might have been both of them, there was a politician there as well, but in any event, when those on the other side of the debate were asked if they accepted that Hamas's actions had been acts of genocide on the 7th of October, they couldn't possibly say. They couldn't possibly say. But Israel in the middle of a war, they can make that assessment on, but the way that they seek to arrive at this assessment is, as I say, by rewriting international law. And they are very honest about this at page 101 of the report, where they reference state intent. And they say that this specific intent that has been tracked through case law and various rulings of the International Court of Justice, this is actually far too narrow. And we need to broaden it out. We need, Amnesty International, it says, considers this as an overly cramped interpretation of international jurisprudence and one that would effectively preclude a finding of genocide in the context of armed conflict. That's what they say, and therefore they seek to rewrite the law. The reason that the case law on this, in the context of armed conflict, making an actual finding of genocide in that context requires genocide to be the only reasonable inference, is specifically because the acts included in the definition of genocide, the killing in particular of members of a group, occur as a matter of course in armed conflict. People die in war. That is a given. That is why the laws of armed conflict regulate as far as possible to ensure that those casualties, those civilian casualties, are kept to an absolute minimum. This is why the jurisprudence that Amnesty International wants to throw out of the window exists. I think it's very telling that they are seeking in plain sight to rewrite international law on this, and it reinforces my point that this process of seeking to upend established international law and use it to target democracies, Israel's the first as the only democracy in the Middle East, but others will follow, mark my words. This process undermines the very international law that they purport to seek to uphold and support. And this is at the center of a much, much deeper clash that we have witnessed in the international legal community for many, many decades. A clash between rule of law countries that see law as a curtailment on government power, and the despots and dictatorships of the world that see law as a means of wielding power. And that clash is visible not just in debates at the United Nations, but also through negotiations over various international conventions. That clash has led already to the manipulation of international law in various respects, because rule of law countries, Norway, the UK, Israel, America, have failed to push back against these attempts to manipulate international law for the advantage of these states, Russia, China, Iran, and its terror proxies. And that is something that I hope the West wakes up to before it is too late. So I hope that this has placed this latest Amnesty report in some context. I hope it has placed some of the recent blood libels in some context. But it's at this point, we're sort of halfway through more or less, that I really want to be able to open up to your questions. I anticipate that there may be some mics that can come round. But if not, I will repeat the question. Here we go. There is a mic. And we've got an immediate question over there towards there's a lady just in the middle. Thank you.
I'll just ask you kindly to say your names and to introduce yourself when you ask a question.
Hello, I'm Catherine Olausen. Thank you for talking about the rule of law. I see how we're losing it in the UK, and I'm so glad for what you're saying. I think of what Douglas Murray said, that he also praised you as a good debate partner. And Douglas Murray has been many times to Israel and spoken of how Israel has given him hope because of the courage and the love of life and the faith shown in Israel. And my question is, it's a personal one. Have you always spoken up for Israel and the rule of law since you were a child? And has faith played any part in that?
So I'm sorry to disappoint if I say that faith hasn't played a part, but I have, so hopefully there's a no and a yes there. I have I have had the privilege, I would say, of certainly advocating, not always for the rule of law, because that for me came somewhat later in life through my legal education and now my professional responsibilities. You know, as a barrister, we do have professional duties to uphold the rule of law, and I take those very seriously, and it's one of the key motivating factors in dealing with this topic and seeking to push back against the weaponization of international law. But I would say that my advocacy for the truth here started about 25 years ago. And I was very young. And in fact, it was Amnesty International that triggered that for me. I was 11, and there was a letter-writing campaign advocating an arms embargo on Israel. And I wrote my own postcard, congratulating the relevant minister in the UK on the close trading relationship between Israel and the United Kingdom, that it was important to support such a key ally, the only democracy in the Middle East. I was 11. I handed it in to the sixth form girl who was 18, who was running the Amnesty International Club, and she said, "We can't send this." I said, "Why?" She said, "You have to copy the text off the board." Now, in fairness to Amnesty, that was their model. You know, they sent in identical postcards, but I then sought to challenge this leader of the club on the content of what was on the board, and it was perfectly clear that she didn't know the first thing about the subject. And for me, that was the trigger to understand. I came with a very privileged position of having travelled in Israel regularly, even up until that point, so I knew that what was being said about this country in a very nice school in the centre of London was totally false. But I also appreciated very readily, very early on, that I had a responsibility to educate myself and to be ready to take on those falsehoods and to challenge them wherever possible. And I hope that through sessions like this, I can encourage others to pick up that mantle, because we may be few in number, but I've always believed in quality over quantity. And the fact of the matter is, we have the truth on our side. The history... Thank you. The truth, the history, the law, and ultimately the justice. And I felt that your question shamed me ever so slightly in this respect, because I appreciate I've given a series of opening remarks which are probably utterly depressing, and I should have included somewhere a note of optimism, and perhaps it is this. A lot of what I have addressed you on already this evening is essentially the centre of what I would call the eighth front of this war. You've heard a great deal about the seven fronts that Israel's fighting on, the kinetic warfare. And this eighth front, which comprises, as I said, the international legal arena, the media, the academy, it's going to be a big battle. And frankly, it hasn't even started yet. But the note of optimism is what Israel has managed to achieve in the last year and a half on those seven fronts, which frankly, if we think back to the position on the 7th of October, I don't think we would have anticipated, I don't think we would have imagined. Miracles have been performed against Hezbollah, against Hamas. What Israel is doing far, far away in Yemen against the Houthis, and what Israel has already done in response to unprecedented direct Iranian strikes on Israeli civilian populations is remarkable. And I think we should take a great deal of optimism and hope from that. I'll keep my answers shorter so we can get more questions in. Thank you.
Just for the next question, I would just let's say sorry that not all the windows are open, but we have protesters outside who are trying to
drown us out.
Drown us out.
If
yes,
only they
as
came
they usually try to
inside,
do,
they might learn something.
But according to the police, it's their freedom of speech, you know.
Okay.
And also, there's no air conditioning here, and we are trying to film this this event so more people can see it. So that's why. So just hold out a few more minutes or half an hour, and we will we will make it.
We'll
And there
keep
are
it
also
quick
cold. There's cold water back there if you need it, please.
Hello, thank you for having you here. It was really a pleasure and an honor. My name is Mary Yakubovich. I'm Israeli French that live in Norway 25 years now. I'm a psychologist, and right now as Israeli French here, and mainly as a psychologist, I'm right now experience very, very tough period. Why? Because all the academic, like we could, are political here. I've never actually known that. After the 7th of October, I went at 7th of October in Israel, and I came here, and then I get a very big shock.
Yeah.
That I'm confronting now with some colleagues that put in their organization paper, right? They're Muslims psychologists. They're never Norwegian psychologists that come with this kind, where are the psychologists to defend what's going on in Gaza, the genocide and everything? And right now I'm going to do it very short because you said educated.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm trying, because I think we have 2 Israeli psychologists in Norway, or 3, that I know, and others, there are some Jewish that don't really, but I know there's also Jewish and non-Jewish that are more to support us. Because the question is, they ask where are the psychologists, right, to defend what's going on in Gaza. So I'm right now going to write, what do they expect from the psychologist?
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I actually think that there is a very important role for psychology to play in explaining the phenomenon that I have been discussing. I have heard the use of the term projection to describe this. I love the fact that you're nodding. I have professional approval, ladies and gentlemen, which is great. So projection is, and in fact, Douglas Murray has mentioned this in the context of quoting Vasily Grossman, tell me what you are guilty of and I will tell you what you accuse the Jews of. But we have seen this certainly through the manipulation and weaponization of international law. I mentioned apartheid and genocide, but those aren't the only legal terms that have been abused in this fashion. Occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism. In every instance, these are the crimes that the Jewish people have suffered, and these are the very crimes that they are being accused of perpetrating. It is, I think, a recognized psychological condition, and it is one that has spread, of course, from, I think, those that might legitimately be diagnosed with it, to infect, everyone. Absolutely. To become the received wisdom. So I would very, very much advocate using and this, if I can just expand it from psychology itself, I think every single individual has it within their power to contribute in some way. Hey, my field happens to be international law. Maybe I got lucky that this is the medium through which Israel is now being attacked. This is the modern form of anti-Semitism, right? We heard it from the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. The evolution of anti-Semitism as a mutating virus. The order of the day today is human rights and international law, and that is the mechanism by which Israel is attacked as the Jewish state. But I'm sure everyone in this room, with their respective backgrounds and expertises, can find their way of contributing to what is ultimately, I believe, the fight of our lives. And it's not just Israel that we're fighting on behalf of, it's Western civilization. Because the people that are manipulating the situation and that are weaponizing these phrases that are skewing public opinion in this fashion and misinforming the masses, the danger on that is not just to Israel, as I said, but for Western civilization as a whole. So I think that's a great example. I know that there are other questions, though.
Yes, so we just have to go to the next question, if there are any others. You had one, right?
But I do think that's a great example of how one needs to engage with this material across sectors.
So just need to be very, short in our
and we'll get through as many as possible.
Questions, because we have a very limited time tonight, because she is going to another event very soon.
To debate amnesty.
It will be a short question and hopefully a short answer. So my name is Ophir Carney, and first I would like to really thank you for what you do. I think that for our darkest days, you were there in the screen and we saw you, and I really think that this hold us stronger. So thank you for that. I as well from Israel, and I was lucky enough to serve in the Israeli army and lead thousands of people directly and indirectly. And I know the values of the Israeli army, and I know what is important to us. So when I come here and I need to justify, I find it's quite difficult. So what I'm looking for is this knockout, that one sentence that I can tell these guys, because I can go on and on and on, but I need one thing that they just put them. So I know it's tough.
No, I know. Listen, thank you for your praise. I'm good, but I'm not a magician. Listen, I think ultimately what I've noticed has people baffled, but I fundamentally believe its validity. Israel has done more for the Palestinian people than any other entity in history. And it continues to. These are people that have been subjugated, that have been used as political pawns in this continued war of annihilation against the Jewish state. And throughout the history of the State of Israel, and I don't just mean the Palestinian Arabs that stayed in Israel and that are now the only free Arabs in the Middle East and enjoy full citizen rights as Israeli citizens, vote in the Knesset, serve in the Knesset, even some of them calling for the destruction of the very state that they're supposed to be serving. But that's the, the incredible value of Israeli democracy. But also the Palestinians in the West Bank that are continually supported by the State of Israel. Why is there no Hamas takeover in the West Bank in the way that they took over the Gaza Strip? It's thanks to Israeli security cooperation. It's in fact only when Israel has come under unrelenting international pressure that the position for the Palestinians has worsened, as we have seen with the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip, and of course with this war being dragged out. I'm glad that you brought up service in the Israeli army. I've spoken to many friends of mine that have been serving in Gaza, and when I've asked them, how's the war going? Often the refrain has been, not bad, considering we're fighting with both hands tied behind our back. So my question has been, why? Why are these soldiers fighting with both hands tied behind their back? And the answer to that really has been this Eighth Front and the international pressure, the unrelenting international pressure on Israel to cease her self-defense and to fight this war with both hands tied behind her back. And I think the importance, and I know this is longer than the sentence that you asked for, but we had the top line sentence and now we've got the explanation for it. The ultimate issue here is that what the international community has done, and we've seen it, prime example in the statement released by the United Kingdom, France and Canada recently, which Hamas welcomed. If you are a Western leader and you say something that Hamas thanks you for, you better check yourself. Statements like that, unrelenting, unsubstantiated, unmerited criticism of the State of Israel, which has encouraged Hamas to continue this war, as opposed to giving up its arms and returning the hostages and ending this and the suffering for the vulnerable in Gaza. This all stems from this misinformation and on this Eighth Front. And I think the only way to grapple with it, I mean, it was frequently said to me before the 7th of October, because I've been doing this a long time, Natasha, if you want to get on to be interviewed on these issues, you have to accept Israel breaks international law. That was what I was told. And I said, I'm not willing to say something that's not true. And quite apart from that, I have no desire to get on for the sake of getting on. Thank you, but the only reason I would conduct myself in this crazy fashion and put myself in these positions is to get this message through. A message that they seem to be entirely unwilling, and they still are, entirely unwilling to hear, to countenance. But it needs to be delivered, and it needs to be delivered robustly. And that's why I chose that example. Because there's not just one golden bullet here. It's relentless, and you have to keep repeating it, and you have to keep explaining it. And actually, recently I was told one of the reasons that Israel's PR is so bad is Zionism. because it's an integral feature of Zionism that Jews believed they no longer had to explain themselves to the non-Jewish world. Well, I'm sorry, that's no longer viable, where we see a direct connection between the lies that are being spread about the Jewish state and Israel's ability to defend herself. So use that line, use any others that you think are effective, but use them. That's the key here. Use them as at every possible opportunity and don't let the lies stand.
Hi, my name is Andreas and I'm from the area here. First time on the meeting. I wrote a question: can international law or cultural strategies peacefully dismantle extremist ideologies like those behind October 7th, avoiding both collateral damage and future attacks? Because it seems to me like we don't have a choice. There are two evils to choose from.
Well, in a word, no. International law isn't going to help us here. There is no mechanism to be able to defeat these ideologies. And I frequently hear people saying that you cannot defeat an ideology militarily. Now, that is not entirely wrong. That's not pertinent to the war that Israel's fighting in Gaza, because it's not just fighting an ideology, it's fighting a terror army, and you can defeat a terror army militarily, and Israel must. But when it comes to the ideology, there is a kernel of truth in this. This has to be attacked in a different way. There has to be a denazification, not just of the Gaza Strip, but of many parts of the Middle East. De-radicalization, it's what we saw in the UAE, and even in Saudi, when both states changed their textbooks. Okay, that is ultimately what led to the Abraham Accords and what was paving the way for Saudi Arabia to join them. De-radicalization is central because the two drivers of this conflict, it's nothing to do with 1 state, 2 states, 3 states, 15 states. It's nothing to do with land. It's not even really to do with religion when it comes down to it. It's to do with the indoctrination of children from kindergarten up to believe that the highest calling in life is to slaughter as many Jews as possible and become a martyr. It is the indoctrination of those children, and it is the incentivization to terror by the so-called moderates in this equation, the Palestinian Authority. They pay the salaries of terrorists no matter what banner they coalesce under. The organizers and orchestrators of the 7th of October, the leaders of the Nukhba force, were paid salaries by the Palestinian Authority, which allowed them the time off to plan these attacks. And until we grapple with the incentivization to terror and the indoctrination to terror, there's no chance of dismantling this ideology, and there's even less chance of getting to a peaceful resolution. I think we've got time for another couple of questions. Yeah, great.
It's just, I'm Isabella Ore. I've lived here many years, but I'm from Switzerland. I think you talk very well, very intellectual, but my everyday experience is what happens now? I have to defend my point of view that never Holocaust I want to have experience again. So I stand up for Israel and the Jews. But I have to defend that because you see all these children dying. You see the latest, that was this hospital that was undermined and many deaths, and that made that was the Israelis that did it, and they said it was because they have the Hamas in the underground, but then it's just a sentence and say, is there an documentation about it? And so you get that in the news and everything. But I wonder, why are the last hostages of 7th of October not back in Israel? What happens there? That's point one. And the other is, why has this first exchange of prisoners happened from Israel, they sent back to the Hamas, through the Hamas, many hostages, but Israel had only 5 or something, very few hostages back. But what I really wondered is that the Hamas were nowhere. They were so-called somewhere in the tunnels or wherever, but all of a sudden
They came up.
They came up like an uniformed in a real with green masks, whatever you call it, and really organized. And now where are them now? They're nowhere.
Well, they came up, I think, importantly, in obscene rituals, which were, of course, in so many respects, overseen and endorsed by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And that's on the back of a year and a half of refusing to even try to access the hostages in Gaza. Utterly, utterly shameful. And I'm bound to say reminiscent of the ICRC's conduct in the Holocaust, where they visited Theresienstadt and said, nothing to see here. I mean, if we want to talk about the responsibility of international institutions, there's a lot to say about the International Committee of the Red Cross. May I just, I don't want to sound nitpicky, but language is really important here. And lots of people have spoken about this prisoner exchange, which is obscene. We are talking about hostages, women and children included, and elderly, who were abducted violently from their homes and have been brutalized for the duration of the period that they were subjected to Hamas captivity. Any sort of moral equivalence between them and the murderers, people with blood on their hands that Israel has been forced to release in order to bring its people home, is, and I know that you weren't making this comparison, but many people do, any comparison along those lines is utterly disgraceful, and it is part and parcel of what I say is encouraging Hamas to continue to terrorize Israelis. But in terms of, why is it that these hostages aren't home yet? I take Antony Blinken at his word, the former Secretary of State of the United States. Towards the end of the last administration, he said, every time we were critical of Israel in public, Hamas left the negotiating table. At least he had, an ounce of credibility, of integrity left to acknowledge the damage that the American administration had done in articulating such disgraceful, unjustified criticism of Israel, in prolonging this conflict, in prolonging the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza and the suffering of the hostages, whom Hamas has no incentive to return if the Americans are suggesting Israel is at fault here. Let us be clear who started this war, who is continuing this war, who could end this war today if they so chose. Why the international community has lost every sense of moral compass in this exercise is somewhat beyond me, despite the psychological analysis that we were engaging in earlier. I still find it impossible to understand, but the effects of it are clear, and the effects of it are to continue suffering on both sides. There, I use that awful phrase, but here it's relevant, and that has to be called out. I completely understand, the difficulties. I share them in having to push back against this tsunami of hate. But it is so important because of the impact, the very practical impact that this misinformation and these appalling equivalencies are having. And that includes the fact that 58 hostages, some alive, some dead, remain in Gaza over a year and a half later. And Israel is between a rock and a hard place. Many people are talking about the protests in Israel at the moment. What I think is often misunderstood in the international community is that everyone agrees on the importance of bringing these people home. Or let's rephrase that, of Hamas letting these people go, because ultimately they are the actor here. Everyone agrees on that. The differences of opinion are on how to achieve this, because it is the most impossible conundrum that you can imagine. These hostages are the only leverage that Hamas has. The only thing that will entreat them to give them up is unrelenting military pressure. And that is what Israel has been restrained from being able to impose on these terrorists. These hostages are Hamas's only key to survival. And until they recognize that survival is no longer an option, they will continue to hold on to them. And that is the quandary, I'm afraid, that we are envisaging. I'm afraid that's taken us to the end of our time together. Andrew, what time
we have
for
time
one more
for
question?
a couple of more questions because we have to leave in a very few minutes.
Okay, I'm going to get shouted at if I'm late to the next one. But
I will make sure that you get on in the car at right times. So that's under control. But just before we let Dag Myhre, who is a local board member in Oslo,
of course,
have a question. I just wanted to say that was nice to hear a question from someone from Switzerland. I don't know how much Norwegian you understand, but as I said in Norwegian before she started, that we are starting with MIF in German this autumn, after the summer. So with a base in Switzerland. So that's, I just wanted to mention that, if you didn't get it in Norwegian. Anyway, here's Dag.
Yeah, Natasha, I've been admiring you for 3 years, since we met in London. I knew nothing about you then, but I didn't even know what the barrister was, so I had to look it up. But I've certainly learned a lot by watching you on the internet and YouTube in these years. I just want to ask you one question. Do you think that the Abraham Accords, do you think that could be a solution out of this conflict? And thank you very much for your speak and everything that we've learned. Thank you.
Thank you. I should have mentioned the Abraham Accords while I was doing my optimistic piece, because it is remarkable that they have lasted throughout this incredibly unpredictable, turbulent and traumatic period. And that should be a cause for great hope and optimism. There were many that were predicting the unravelling of these accords in the context of what was transpiring after the 7th of October, and I think it's also indicative of the way that the Arab world has begun to view the Palestinian cause. And in fact, in private, you will hear many of these Arab leaders and officials talking about how problematic they understand what the Palestinian cause has ultimately become. And this call, as we were talking about earlier, of this genocidal call to annihilate the State of Israel, is at least something that the Abraham Accords countries have given up on. And if they can, others can possibly follow suit. And I think that is a great cause for optimism, and to seek to reinstitute similar connections. Of course, it's important to recognise that these accords didn't happen out of the blue. They were built on many, many years of people-to-people cooperation and normalisation. And that is ultimately what can be achieved when you tackle the two I's, the two drivers of this conflict: incentivization to terror and indoctrination to terror.